Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home program. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, and each week I have this is a new year, an opportunity to share with you the journeys of men and women who are drawn by their faith and the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, awakened by the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit to the fullness of the faith in the Catholic Church. And they're here to share their journeys. And Albert Holder, who's our guest for tonight, is a former Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints member, and he's going to explain the difference between all the different Mormon groups, so that I know we get many questions from viewers who enjoy hearing the stories of Mormons who've come home to the church, because invariably we get those folk knocking at our door and we're not sure how to answer them. So Albert, wonderful to have you on the Journey Home program.
Thank you, Marcus.
It's been a number of years since you and I met. It's been
probably
almost 20 years, right? Come to think of it, it is 20 years this year. That's right. And so that means you and I have both been in the church about that long, and the Lord's brought us both on different avenues of service. So it's good to have you join us on the program. I mentioned, as you heard in the opening, that I may have to have you define the different Mormon groups, but I'll let you do that in the context of your story. But as I normally do in the program, I invite you to take a big step back and start from the beginning.
Okay.
So the audience knows where you come from spiritually.
Sure. Well, I was raised in what Marcus said is the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I grew up in that church, and that church is and I was the son of a minister in that church,
okay.
What they call a 70. Which is an ordained missionary to go out and do mission work. So my father was in Honduras, he was in Brazil, he was in Mexico, and some of those trips occurred even before I was born. My sister and brother were both born in Brazil while he was there setting up a mission for that church. This is back in the late 60s, early 70s. Just before I was born, we relocated back to the States, to the headquarters of the church, which is in Independence, Missouri.
So totally separate from what we think of as the Mormon Church.
Exactly, and I'll kind of outline that in just a moment. And so he did all that missionary work.
Now, when we think of Mormon missionaries, the two guys in their suits that knock at our doors once in a while, is what your father doing the next step up from that, essentially?
Yes, because a Mormon missionary typically does that for a 2-year period of time. What the office of 70 is, which is an office of priesthood of the elders. All those folks that you see knocking at your door are elders, but they're ordained in the Mormon Church at 16 or 17 years old before they do their mission. My dad did some missionary work when he was a young man, but then right after he right after he finished in the Peace Corps, he was in the Peace Corps when he was first married, he entered the being a missionary as a career, a professional career on behalf of the Reorganized Latter-day Saint Church. And just to get us a step back for a minute, the difference between the two churches. The church that is what we call the Mormon Church, or the LDS for Latter-day Saint Church, which is primarily based out of Utah, shares a common history with our church in that, of course, both branches believe Joseph Smith was the founder of a new church, in fact, of a Church of Jesus Christ that had long since gone into apostasy, and then it was through these prophetic and these miraculous experiences that he had that restored the true church to the earth, and in that process restored the priesthood that had gone away.
Right.
And so Joseph Smith was the common founder, and then the difference begins if you follow the Mormon history. That was up in New York. Of course, he was given a whole new revelation of Jesus, a New Testament for a new world. So the whole idea that Jesus Christ visited the new world, and there was a group of Jews who had migrated over during, no one's exactly sure, during the diaspora of the Jews or whatnot, but preaching the gospel to the lost tribes of Israel in the New World, and then they had this whole era of Christianity, the golden age of Christianity here in the New World somewhere, which was then supplanted by that church went into apostasy, and then there was, rampant paganism that took over with the pagan religions that you see in some of the Aztecs and the Mayans and so forth. They started that church, Joseph Smith did, up in New York. And as you follow that history, they were involved in a variety of skirmishes with various local groups. Right. And there are some connections with, as they would move west, one of the biggest scandals early on was the Nauvoo bank scandal in Illinois, where they attempted to live in common, as the Acts of the Apostles says, and put all their money in the church, and then the church was going to divvy it up according to everyone's need. And of course, as we all know, human beings being human, although that's a wonderful idea, there was a great scandal that occurred, and they were run out of town. The bank was closed. So as they moved west, they finally got as far as Missouri. And it was in Missouri where Joseph Smith, they had a number of skirmishes with the local militia in Missouri. And it's a fascinating history, and I don't want to go too long on it, but just to say that as this group would move into a small frontier town, they would literally take over sort of ownership. And so from a local political standpoint, there was instability when the Mormons or this group would come into town, because they would vote in block, and pretty soon they would own the town. And so they would do that through connections with the Masonic lodges that were being formed in these small towns as they moved west.
Was there a direct Masonic connection?
There certainly is. If you look at
modeled
if you look at the Nauvoo temple that was built, which is actually in the ownership of the Reorganized Latter-day Saint Church in Nauvoo, Illinois, and you go into that temple, there are very characteristic Masonic symbols that you can just see in the artwork and the architecture. So it's an interesting connection, but I don't think anyone's they would not own it as such, that the connection was there. But I think they were looking for rituals to express certain things that they were doing in the temple, and so they borrowed some of those rituals from the Masonic lodges that they got in contact with.
Some of their members had been members of.
Exactly.
When they became brought in.
So what happened?
They get to Missouri.
They get to Missouri, and there's a lot of skirmishes going on with the state militia. There was people being tarred and feathered, and of course all this is, for the sake of Jesus Christ, and seen as martyrdom and persecution. And so much so that finally Joseph Smith is imprisoned, and he gets word that the governor is there's a mob basically gathering to overtake the jail, and the governor has basically had it with this group. So he decides to leave only a couple of guards on the jail, knowing, of course, that the mob is going to overwhelm it. So that word gets into Joseph Smith. Some of his friends on the outside smuggle a couple of pistols into him, and him and one of his colleagues were in the jail, and they tried to bust out of the jail to escape, and he was shot in the window of a 2-story jail, and he fell to his death. When that happened, and I won't be able to remember the exact year, it was in the early 1800s. I think it was 1823, but I have to go back to but when that happened, it created a void of authority at the leadership of the organization. Brigham Young was one of the what they called the Apostles of the Quorum of 12, which was the next rung down of leadership below the prophet, which was what Joseph Smith claimed to be. So when Joseph Smith was killed, there was this group had no leader. And so Brigham Young stepped into the void to take over that leadership position, and decided, with most people's approval, because they were being persecuted where they were, let's move west. The only problem is that Joseph Smith, before he was killed, had ordained his son through a prophetic utterance that this would be the next leader of this church, this movement. In fact, the whole notion of a prophet, and that whole is very sort of akin to the Old Testament, in that the prophetic powers would pass down through Joseph Smith's bloodline. So it was very interesting. And so Joseph Smith's family, his wife Emma, and his members of his family did not go west. His son was only 14 at the time, so he wasn't in a position to take over. But when he was 26 years old, 12 years later, he reinstituted or reorganized the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was the church I grew up in.
So when we see the word reorganized in the long title of the church, that's the connection.
That's the connection. So basically, we take fellowship. We follow Joseph Smith's son, you could say, and then the Mormons follow Brigham Young, and we both have a common heritage in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of how the history breaks down. Now, there's a lot of the peculiarly Mormon doctrines of polygamy, the Adam God theory, as people call it. There's 2 books of scripture that the Mormons have that the Reorganized Latter-day Saint Church never recognized as authoritative. The Book of Moses and the Pearl of Great Price are 2 books that Joseph Smith received, and the position of the church I grew up in was that those were private revelations. He never presented them as public revelation for the church. When the church went west, those were adopted, and so the Mormons in Utah, they have what's called a quad, which is their 4 books of scripture, and we have 3. So you have the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and then the Doctrine and Covenants, which is this idea of open canon of Scripture, which means that every 3 or 4 years, the prophet, leader of the church, has a divine utterance or prophetic utterance. And it's very unique because they have this utterance, this revelation, which gets added to the public revelation of Scripture, but you vote on it every 4 years. So it's an interesting combination of sort of Americanism and democracy and consent rule, and sort of the idea of,
Is that with both churches or just yours?
I believe that's how they also do it in the Utah church.
You have this extra set.
They both have an open canon, and the prophet of each church is receiving a revelation every 4 years. That they convene the council, the assemblies convene, and representatives from all over the world come and hear the new revelation and then vote on it. And then it gets added to that 3rd book. But see, the Mormons have that 4th book, which is the Pearl of Great Price, which is supposed revelation that Moses was given on the mountain, which because the people weren't prepared to receive it, was never presented. But Joseph Smith claims that was part of what God had always intended. And so it's in those places that you find some of this notion of what's called the Adam God theory.
All of us become gods.
All of us become gods. We all get our own planet. Even some of the notions of spiritual polygamy and marry more than one woman in this life, so that you have a greater prosperity in the next.
What about the idea that really we don't see Christ, that Jesus as the divine Son of God, but as one of many sons?
Right.
Is that more the Mormon?
That's more the Mormons. I would. It's a little bit, and this gets into just sort of very technical theology.
Sure.
I was actually in Rome studying after I was a Catholic, and they met with the Roman Rota secretary who came and wanted to. This was right before the Roman Rota came out and declared Mormon baptism invalid. And so we had conversations when I was there about trying to understand what does it mean to be baptized, and why is it that in extraordinary circumstances, even a non-believer can baptize, provided he intends to do what the church intends by the sacrament. Yeah. But the problem with the Mormon baptism is that there's an alternative intent in that baptism. It's not that they intend what the church intends; they intend what Jesus has revealed to Joseph Smith intends by this sacrament. And so because of that, and because the notion of the Godhead is not Trinitarian, right. Those reasons they said it wasn't valid. So, but the church I was in was the way I like to describe it is, as the larger church, which was the Mormon church, is much larger. They developed a theology faculty. They've spent now almost 200 years reflecting on their writings. There has been an attempt to put some rational reason and development of this thought within a system. Mm-hmm. The church I was in always remained very grassroots because of its size, and so it wasn't, there was very much still tied to the sources. And so we believe in the New Testament, and certainly Jesus says, "Go out and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit." It wasn't as clearly, those doctrines were never adopted as they were, because as you might imagine, there was quite an animosity between those sects, and so we would never look to Utah to understand the revelation that we think we have from Joseph Smith. And so it's always, at least while I was in it, it always remained somewhat undeveloped and undefined. Some ministers would say, yes, we believe in the Trinity. In my church, some would say no.
So yours would be more like many of the non-Catholic Christian traditions in America that are small and more independent, guided by their local pastors, maybe by a very charismatic local pastor that has a big influence on more than just a local church, on lots of churches in this association of churches.
Somewhat, but we did have a leadership, and there was, but they were,
You had more than just the Bible.
Right, but you had the leadership of this church, and keep in mind, Joseph Smith went on record before he received these revelations. This is early on. He said, "Mine is a creedless faith." So he took you might say because of the context he grew up in, he took a very anti-Catholic position on creeds. Now,
many of the other
traditions
that started during that same time period in America were similar.
And but there was authority. There was a mechanism for silencing the priesthood if they did things, So it wasn't just your local pastor. He did report to the leader of that region, who then reported to the leader of that nation, and so there was, the mechanisms were there, and then they had an international assembly where they would review the revelation.
But a big emphasis on a reestablishment of the Levitical priesthood from the Old Testament was a big part of the...
Yes. And the Melchizedek priesthood actually was even more, both branches of the priesthood were restored under Joseph, purportedly restored.
The other thing I was going to ask you, that I would say most non-Catholic Christian traditions see themselves, their existence, I'm speaking very generally here, see themselves in existence often over-opposed to another group.
Yes.
I was brought up Lutheranism. We existed because of Martin Luther's rebellion, or not, we wouldn't call it rebellion, of course, but correction of the direction of the church back. So it would have been against Rome.
Right.
Though later, when I was a Congregationalist, we saw ourselves different from the other Protestant churches. We didn't see ourselves anymore talking against Rome. We were talking about the other Protestant churches. So you're brought up with your group versus
the Mormons in Utah. Yes. In fact, every time in a conversation someone asked me where I went to church, I would say it, and then they'd say, "Oh, you're Mormon." I'd say, "No, I'm not Mormon," and then they would just start this 10-minute description of how we weren't and so forth. But,
which, I don't know if this is the point for you to talk about it, but it's even a bit more confusing because your church changed its name, right? Even more contemporary.
Yes, we can, back in, I think in 2000, I'm not exactly sure, because I've been a Catholic now almost 20 years. They have distanced themselves from their Joseph Smith roots, removing the Latter-day Saint reference from their name, and now are called the Church of Christ, the Community Church of Christ. Okay. But they kept they have a seal that they use. They did keep the symbol of the church, but
did they set aside some of their Adventist ideas because the turn of the century didn't mean the end of the world? Because a lot of people were cashing a lot of eggs to the end of the...
Well, we'll get into that a little bit. I think to answer it shortly, I think yes and no.
Okay.
I think they
let's get back to your story. I'm sorry. This has been fascinating. Thanks for the back.
Well, hopefully that's helpful to the viewers.
I think it's very important.
It's a very different... I guess I could say it is, when you're in it, you're very sure you're not Mormon. But now that I'm Catholic, the similarities are certainly there. They're great.
Sure.
But it is.
You saw yourself as a young man. You weren't a Mormon, and you certainly weren't a Catholic.
That's right. Now, so my father, getting back to sort of how we move along on this story. My father did all this missionary work overseas, and then across the Southwest. We were in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana primarily, moving about every 2 years. because this organization was pretty small, so everywhere we go, we were basically setting up a mission church. Sometime in 1985, and I don't know exactly because I would have been only a teenager, actually before that, my father before that, he would say he had real reservations about the Mormon gospel. And if anyone had followed my father's preaching, because every Sunday he would get up and preach, sometime in the mid to late 70s, he stopped preaching so much from these other books, and he would primarily preach from the Bible. Now, there's a whole nother layer there, because the Reorganized Church also has a re-inspired Bible that Joseph Smith sat down to re-inspire, because, and this is interesting, because if you read the foreword to it, he quotes Jerome. And of course, Jerome is complaining about the poor translations, right? Yep. And so Jerome's one who we got the Vulgate, but he went back to the original sources and gave us a better translation than what was being circulated at the time. Well, Joseph Smith somehow read about that and took that as fodder for the need to have a direct new inspiration for the Bible. He didn't finish it. He started at the beginning, so he started in Genesis and he started in Matthew. And so there's a lot of changes in both of those books, but then elsewhere in the Bible it reads like the King James. The Mormon Church never adopted that as a canon. So if you look at a Mormon Bible, they will have the King James English, and in the footnotes they'll have Joseph Smith's. Anywhere Joseph Smith changed it, they'll have the footnote. We adopted it. So ours is, or the LDS Church did, and ours is they call it the inspired version, which, looking back on it now, I mean, it's somewhat offensive to the rest of the Christian world, but anyway, because it would suggest that any other version is not inspired, right? So, right. But he began preaching primarily from the Bible.
From the inspired version.
Right, but even that, there were places where the re-inspiration didn't make a lot of sense. So as an example, when Jesus is talking in the Sermon on the Mount about if someone asks you to give you his cloak, give you his cape, give him your cloak. If he asks you to go a mile, go with him too. So it's going that extra mile, that phrase, It's so common. Well, it gets re-inspired to if someone asks you to go a mile, go a mile. If someone asks you to go 2 miles, go 2 miles. And so the whole notion of going the extra mile is just lost in that translation. But there are other types, but that's one of the ones that was always sort of...
So your dad was opting out for the traditional translation.
Yeah. Yeah. And my dad was a big reader of Lewis, C.S. Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And so he was never really, I think very early on in his ministry, he was never quite sure about this claim that this great apostasy had occurred, and of course no one knew exactly when. Was it when Constantine marched his army through the water and that was baptism? Was that, a terrible thing, like sort of a sign that the church had entered apostasy? Was it, no one could actually put their finger on an exact date, but nonetheless, we had the Dark Ages. Everybody knew that we had the Dark Ages, so we knew at some point the light went out. And so the light went out, and we needed the light to come back on. And that was the whole purpose of Mormonism, was to bring the light, the gospel, back to the earth. And it took the digging up of another witness that had been buried for such, this was God's providence, that he had buried a second witness of Jesus coming to another place, so that when the first thing didn't work out, he had it in his back pocket to restore the church again.
It's interesting, I've never heard that angle again, but it just, again, reemphasizes the fact that often these new movements are based on a straw man.
Yes.
The idea that the light went out in the Dark Ages isn't true.
Right.
So you start with a false assumption, and then you have a whole new movement based on a false assumption. But anyways, go.
So he began preaching and reading Lewis's books, and as a kid, my dad read us the Chronicles of Narnia. He also started reading Tolkien's books. So in some way, his mind was being formed through Lewis and Tolkien in a very Catholic manner, I think unbeknownst to him at the time. And in the early 80s, we were on mission to Brazil to set up. We had been called down to São Paulo to set up a mission. When we got there, about a year later, the institutional church there was a revelation that came from the new prophet. And that revelation said...
When you say institution, you mean the Mormons?
I mean the Reorganized Latter-day Saint
Your
Church.
institutional church.
Our institutional church.
A separate prophet.
Right. We had the descendant of Joseph Smith as our leader.
Okay, got it.
7 generations
Still,
down.
wow,
Well,
okay.
and this will get into what happened to them.
Yeah.
As they moved away from those historical roots, that requirement for the leadership was removed.
All right.
That connection, that physical bloodline connection. So, anyway, the revelation was that women were to be members of the priesthood. There was also a revelation that we should open our communion to other Christians, actually to anyone of goodwill. Anyone that would come to our service, we should have open communion. So you talked before we started the program, a little bit about sort of a liberal, maybe a false ecumenism or a sense of trying to bring us all together. And so I think there was there was a movement in the leadership of that church that was moving towards trying to be like everyone else. And so these were things that other churches were doing.
Right.
Well, my father couldn't square that with the New Testament, and he had done enough reading at this point to know that this wasn't a new issue, that there had, these are things that were discussed even in the early church, and had been discussed in the Anglican church. And I don't know exactly how, but he began to correspond. I think he stumbled across an article by a man named Sheldon Van Auken. Yeah. And Sheldon Van Auken has a wonderful conversion story. He's since passed away.
Grief Observed?
A Severe Mercy.
Severe Mercy.
And Under the Mercy.
Yes, that's right. Grief Observed, I think was the last. That's right.
He was a student of Lewis as an atheist, and then through the death of his wife, was brought to the faith. And so he calls that a severe mercy because, as he saw it, it took her death to bring him to Jesus Christ. He became an Anglican. But then, when the Anglican Church ordained women, I'm not exactly sure when that was, but I think it was sometime in the 80s and there, he became a Catholic. So he wrote a number of articles on this whole issue, and somehow my father, I don't know if it's because he knew Lewis, but somehow, he knew Lewis's writings, he found the articles. And so he wrote to Van Auken, and he said, I'm in this church, I'm in Brazil, I saw this article, I'll be interested in any other sources you have. So very, very early on in my father's journey into Rome, he's reading de Lubac and Bouillet, these French Jesuits, about the male, the priesthood and the beauty of the priesthood, and what was Jesus' intent in reserving it to an all-male priesthood, and what did all that mean? And so he writes this tract, and publishes it for what now becomes another group within this smaller Mormon church, sort of the conservative, Orthodox, what we would say Orthodox group, quoting, de Lubac and Bouillet and, just SJ after their name. And I remember after I had become a Catholic, looking back at this tract, thinking, what did people think when they read? And that, of course, had the same kind of thing when I read the foreword of the Bible and saw quotes from St. Jerome, thinking, it's just so out of context. You think, who do they think these people were? They're the whore of Babylon, as they would say. But so, and this is getting to one of, I think, the first steps into my own conversion. But so we were in Rome, we were in Brazil doing missionary work. My dad was, of course, having great misgivings with the leadership of the church. Really searching, getting more information from Van Auken. They had, corresponded a few times via the mail. And one of the last correspondence, and Van Auken's correspondences were always on a little postcard, but he would type them, so they were always like, At the end of the letter to my dad, after he, gave him some more sources to look at, he said, "Why not come home to Mother Church?" And that was like one of those moments, where, the blinders and the scales from my dad's eyes just sort of, fell off. And it was breathtaking. And he thought, yeah, why not come home to Mother Church? Now, that was probably 84, 83. And he didn't come into the church until 89, so it took a few more years. But that event, I think, did help him move out of what we called, he was really a career missionary. and stopped working, for the church professionally, as a career. He left appointment and moved back to the States and became...
Did he leave before he became Catholic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So now he was out of a job and looking for work.
The point being that he made that difficult decision out of conviction.
Yeah, he couldn't follow the leadership anymore because of what they were doing, and he became convinced that he wasn't sure. It was a shot across the bow, those words from Van Auken.
Yeah.
And not maliciously. I mean, Van Auken was basically saying this was my answer to my problem. I became Catholic. Right. He says, and I don't remember this, I was 13 at the time, and I was the youngest of 4. He says he came to me because I was the youngest. We had been a missionary family. Our identity was wrapped up in this church. All of our friends, all of the men that my dad had been missionaries with, we called uncle. I mean, he says he wanted to see how I would take it, what would happen if Dad became Catholic, what would that do to my sort of worldview. He says I just broke down and cried. And to this day, I don't remember the event. So it was pretty traumatizing to a 13-year-old boy who basically looked up to his father for everything.
Yeah.
But we came back to the States, and my dad became a school teacher. And I'll just share one more experience of his story, because I think it leads into...
Then we'll take a break. Why don't you do that first, then we'll take a break.
Oh, we can... Okay.
Or unless you want to take a break now, it'd be a good time.
That would be fine.
Okay, let's do this. Let's pause at this moment. It's that time in the program to take a break. We'll come back in a little bit and hear the rest of Albert Holder's journey to the church. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Albert Holder, and I've been getting him off track with all this great background information about the different Mormon traditions. And so I told you during the break, what your father, the conviction that he took a stand on, is very honorable, and to me a very deep sign of the work of God in his life. To recognize, that I'm not going to be in the pulpit anymore. I shouldn't be there. And he made that decision, which shares with his 13-year-old was tough, right?
Yes, it was very tough. So we come back to the States, and my dad becomes a school teacher, and actually starts goes back to graduate school and does a master's degree in English. And through the course of his study, he begins to read Catholic writers, and he's becoming more and more intellectually convicted about the truths of Catholicism. Just brief background, the church that I was in was now in a lot of turmoil because of, you might say, these two groups. Those that were sort of vying to keep the historical traditions alive and the sort of orthodox in the sense of true to the teaching that had come down from Joseph Smith, versus those that were more liberalizing that tradition and trying to sort of find common ground with other Christian denominations. So right away when we came back, that church split in half. And the institutional church went its own way, and then we were part of this really almost like a Protestant, a sect of this sect of Mormonism. So we were meeting church in our house. That's how small we were at this point. We were about 60 families, and we were in South Texas, where we had lived once before. And my dad was out one night, so we would set up church every Sunday morning, pull out all the couches. We had like a ranch-style home, put in folding chairs. We had even had a sound system, and we would have Sunday service. One of these weekends, my dad was with a friend who was probably one of our closest, his closest friend, and someone that I called uncle, very, very close. And at this point, they had been ministers for, 30 plus years together.
Wow.
And they were sharing, I guess, very personal things and having kind of a heart-to-heart. Because at this point, I think I mentioned this to you before, there was all sorts of religious experiences that were going around to sort of substantiate the existence of this broken group. Because now we had no tie to the institutional church, and so we're trying to sort of verify or find validity for why we're broken away. And so there were various people who had, supposed inspirations of the Spirit saying, this is now the 3 days of darkness in Revelations, where the church is in hiding, and it's going to be 3 years, and so this was this 3-year period of time where my dad, I think, you talked about him having the courage. He certainly did have the courage, but it did take him a few more years.
Sure.
And I think he was wondering whether I, as the youngest, could take this. My brother was 6 years older than me. He's the oldest, and so there were 6 years there. So in part, I think he was waiting, but also I think he was still wondering whether this was going to work out. Was Jesus going to come back and restore the church for the third time? Nobody knew. So he's out having this conversation, and they're sharing very personal things. And his friend turns to him and says, "What you want is for someone to say, 'Te absolvo.'" And he said it in Latin. And he said, and of course that means that's what the priest would say to you in the old rite, in confession. You are absolved. And I really think, and my dad has said this, if that had not happened, I think my dad could have thought about being Catholic for another 10 years. Oh. But it was a real conviction, and he left that encounter and sought out a priest. Because he realized that if the power to forgive sins was really available in this world through the power of a sacrament, I want it. I need it. Okay. And so that was 88, and in 89 he comes into the church. During that short period of time, I was a sophomore in high school. My mother, who had been raised a Catholic and had had some rather unique experiences when she was leaving the Catholic Church to marry my dad. She had a very powerful, she went on a women's retreat with a group of these ladies that were in this church. And she had an experience that basically told her that it would be okay to marry my father. That's all it said to her. Well, because it was a retreat and a religious experience, my dad had always interpreted that experience for her as this was validity, that this was the true church of Jesus Christ that Christ had established in the latter days. So he really thought she was going to have a real problem, with his conversion.
Okay.
And of course, when he finally got the courage to tell her, she was delighted, to say the least. And he said, well, wait a minute. I mean, what about, this? You had this experience. It told you that this was the true church and that your Catholic church was the whore of Babylon. And she said, no, I didn't. I never had that experience. And so all of a sudden, what two people, it was her experience. He wasn't even there, but what he had relied on wasn't based on
He had read
truth.
into her experience
Exactly.
kind of what he not wanted to, but just assumed that it would be right.
Assumed.
Wow.
So she comes back to the church, makes a confession, and they both enter the church together on Easter Vigil of 1989. So this is where at this point, I'm a senior in high school. My brother is out of college in graduate school. So this was big news. I mean, this was like catastrophic news. And as you might imagine, as a young man, I was trying to be an adult and then still very hurt as a son, that he would betray me like this. He would disown me like this. In fact, when we were still meeting, we still had church in our house. While he was in RCIA, we had church up until, it must have been 2 months before he entered the church. So he would leave to go to RCIA and Mass, and then my mom and I would set up church, and 60 people would show up. And so it was a very difficult time.
2 questions. I don't want to delay it because of time, but number one, were you a religious young man?
Yes. Yes.
So you believed.
I believed. I went to church every Sunday. I was convinced that this was.
Yeah.
Now, I had experienced this rift when we left Brazil, and I knew we were now part of this other group. But you can imagine your identity is even more kind of untenable, And so more and more of the preaching in this little group was all about our identity. And while we were right, and we were right, and everyone else was wrong. And so your view of God and God's sovereignty and his power for the world, for the sake of the world, just was continually shrinking, because it was already pretty small, right? Once we moved from the world to Mormonism, and then you move from Mormonism to this Joseph Smith's version that we followed, and then we broke away from that, so we were even now in this even smaller group. So I had my own, as whatever level of faith I had as a teenager, I had my own wonderings, but it didn't help to have those doubts and see what my dad had done, because it caused a lot of pain and a lot of sorrow for people that were very close to us. And we were basically disowned. In fact, during that first year, while my dad was going into the church, he was in RCIA, people told us that my mother should divorce him and that we should shun him as a way of sort of spiritually trying to wake him back up.
Sure.
And so much so that people were telling us he's under the influence of an evil spirit. And I remember thinking, and as angry as I was at my dad, I remember looking at him and when I would talk to him, and I said, I don't agree with what he's doing, but I don't see a man that's possessed by an evil spirit. And I couldn't square that with the experience I was having with my father. But I also couldn't simply follow along. I needed my own experience about what was happening to be able to say that the Catholic Church was really the Church Jesus Christ had founded. And that would take another 3 years. So I left, I graduated high school early, and went and sought solace with my older brothers, thinking we'll become, we'll have, everything will return to the way it was, with my two older brothers. Well, in 6 months' time, my oldest brother is in RCIA, and he's becoming a Catholic. So I was like, well, that doesn't work out too well. And then my other brother, a year later, enters the church. So at this point, I just sort of, everyone's abandoning me, And so at this point, I make the decision that God is bigger than all religion. No one religion is right. All religions have something good. So the best approach to this whole subject is to just not be a member of any church and sort of pick and choose from things I read that I like. And that would be, I'd be sort of enlightened and live a happy life. But I wasn't happy because, as we all know, happiness comes in giving your life to God. So I had put up a barrier. Were you still single
at this point?
I was.
Okay.
Right. I put up this sort of wall. God could get only so close to me because I had sort of been burned previously. So this goes on for a couple of years, and my brother and I used to kid because my brother always thought that taking philosophy courses, you had to be mature. And so I'd always wanted to take a philosophy course or a literature class. I was a math and engineering student, say. But I had one more humanities course that I had to take. And at this point, I'm at Kansas University. My brother's in graduate school. He's Catholic. And I'm there. And I'm like, gosh darn it, I'm just going to take my humanities. I could have taken anything, but I'm going to take this. And I took it on the survey of medieval poetry. Actually, it was just called Survey of Poetry. And there's 19 sections of it in the KU catalog. And you pick one that works in your schedule, and you pick it from taught by staff. Well, as God would have it, in his providence, I picked the class that was taught by David Whalen, who was a professor and a Catholic with 6 children, doing his dissertation on Cardinal Newman. So you can only imagine the type of poets that we read in his class. most of them all Catholic, if not Catholic, most of them Catholic thinking poets, even if they weren't Catholic. And so that course in poetry, from John Donne to Gerard Manley Hopkins to, and there are many others, but that course was like a door to grace, because it wasn't apologetics, it wasn't overtly trying to convince me of Catholicism, but it was opening my mind again to the beauty and the goodness and the truth of God in a way that I don't think I would have heard it any other way, because at this point I'd had 3 years of battling with my dad, over, Mariology, over, you name it. I mean, I would just pick fights with him, on different Catholic, sort of standard Catholic topics. And of course, he would just come back, because he would say, oh yeah, I used to think that too, that, Mariology was a medieval invention, or the Mass was a medieval invention. And of course, as you go back and look at the sources, all of a sudden you find, the prayer of Hippolytus, the priest from the 2nd century, or Justin Martyr's, liturgy from, all of a sudden the Mass is this ancient ritual of how it has always been. So I didn't like having those conversations with my dad, because I usually lost. So, that's kind of where it was. But that class was a real opening in my heart. And I finished that class, and Professor Whalen and I came somewhat close. And he told me, he goes, if you're really interested in studying medieval thought or philosophy, and even theology, he says, you need to go to a small liberal arts school where they still appreciate the sources. Because if you stay here, you can study Aquinas here, you can study the medievals, but what you're going to end up studying is studying them through a lens. So through the feminist lens, or through a deconstructionist lens, or did Aquinas really write this? And looking at which there's some value in some of those studies, but they sometimes lose sight of the source. And what is the source really trying to say to you? So he's the one that made the suggestion that I go to another school. So when I tell my dad this, and of course in my mind I had decided, well, there's only really 2 choices. It's either going to be a Protestant liberal arts college, or it's going to be a Catholic liberal arts college, if I'm going to get an appreciation of the sources. I couldn't see myself knowing, and this just begs my own ignorance, but my own experience of Protestants, where they would just beat me to death to try to make me convert me because I'm not saved or something, and I was like, hey, I just don't want to put up with that. Catholics are more laid back, they'll leave me alone, I can be whatever I want. So I right away had removed one whole set of schools. So I told my dad that I would be interested in going to a small private Catholic liberal arts school. And he was like, amazed. And of course, he at this time is doing a catechetical degree at Notre Dame Institute. So he meets some people from Franciscan University. And they're like, oh, we have this great school for your son, you'll love it. And so he calls me up and says, you should go to Franciscan University in Steubenville. I'm like, where? What? Never heard of it. And so to make a long story short, I went and visited in the middle of the summer. Nobody was around. And my dad had read some of Dr. Scott Hahn's books and knew he was a professor there. And we were meeting with one of the persons in admissions, and my dad's like, and we're like, can we meet some of the professors in theology or philosophy? Nobody was around. It was like August, right before school, so everybody's on vacation. And he's like, well, I think Scott Hahn is in town. I'm like, okay. I had never heard of Scott Hahn at this time. My dad had heard of him. He said, oh, that'd be great. Let's see if we can meet him. I was like, okay. So it was very funny because they had me call him, just out of the blue. I call him up at his house. And in typical Scott Hahn fashion, he tells me to come in 19 minutes, and I have 14 minutes or something. It was very like, yes, you can come at 7:19, and I'm like, okay. So we go over there, and immediately my dad and him start talking, and he's reading a book on the Melchizedek priesthood and
of course.
Something. So they're going at it, theology and all this, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is supposed to be about me. And so I finally brought the conversation back to myself, and I was like, no. Professor Hahn turned and said, so what's your story? What's going on? Are you going to come or not? And I said, at this point, I'm feeling very intimidated by the whole idea of coming to a school to sort of, because I was very attracted to it. I'd spent the whole day on campus, and not going into a lot of details, I was very attracted to the school. And I said, I can make it on my own where I'm at. I can make it. I'm doing fine. And he just turned to me and said, yeah, you'll probably make it where you're at. But if you come here, you're going to thrive. And it's, again, one of those experiences you have where someone you don't even know says something and it's sort of a light goes on. I didn't know what that was going to mean, thrive, but I knew I wanted to find out. And so I made the decision to come. And when I was, at this point, I had fairly familiar with Mass. I had helped my brother basically support him become Catholic when I was living with him, even though I didn't accept what he was doing. Like a good brother, I was trying to support him, so I was very familiar with the Mass. And so at one experience, which I'll end with this, because this is really what brought me into the church, sitting in the tent, a large outdoor setting Mass on the Feast of St. Francis, October the 4th, 1992. And lots of questions swirling in my mind at this point. I've been at Steubenville taking theology, philosophy courses. A lot of things are not adding up. And I'm sitting there in Mass and I say to myself, just one of those times where you realize God is here. It became so clear to me God was present, and I could ask one question and get one answer. So I was like, what do I need an answer to? And of course, I looked up and I saw the Lord, the Blessed Sacrament being distributed at communion. I said, Jesus, is that really you? And it was in my heart a real conviction that this was the Lord. So I, at that point, made the decision that I wanted to be Catholic. And that was in at RCA, and then was received in the spring of 1993.
The Lord guides our lives. As you look back, was your experience in that Mormon sect preparing you for the Catholic Church?
Yes, in a lot of ways. One of the things that, I don't know how, I think my dad's willingness to follow the truth wherever it would lead him was a very powerful witness. Now, I didn't like where it led him.
At the time.
But as I said, I could not accept the notion that he was, possessed. Maybe he was wrong, but the idea that he was, that was what was going on never fit. So certainly that experience of church was very formative in my life. Mm-hmm.
But the Lord had worked with you even all along. He bring you a young man of faith, though that was kind of the trajectory towards the church, but it wasn't the truth yet. Did you meet your wife at Franciscan, or?
I didn't. I left Franciscan and then went on for graduate studies in Rome as a layman. And when I arrived, she was there studying also graduate school. And we met in the first week. And after 2 years, got married and then stayed 2 more years in Rome, both finishing up our degrees. And I met her there.
Let's assume we've got somebody watching maybe in this last minute that's right now where you were. Why should they consider the fullness of the Catholic faith?
In your life, it's a decision that has defined who I am. One of the things that I remember very clearly is the realization that I don't own the truth. We owned the truth in my other church. It was always, and it was an ever shrinking amount of truth, and ever shrinking members who even thought like you did. And while I understood that when I became Catholic, I was embracing the fullness of that truth, I was embracing it. I was serving the truth, because the truth is incarnated in Jesus Christ. It's not something I put in my back pocket to whip out and kind of beat someone over the head with, but it's ever challenging me in my own life to better conform to it. So I would say that was one of the big sea changes in my thinking about even who God is and how he relates to us.
All right. Thanks for summarizing and
Thank
not
you.
only your
Thank
own
you.
journey, but all the interesting differences between the different Mormon churches that we run into out there in our world. So thanks a lot, Albert.
Thank you
God
for
bless
having me.
And your work. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I hope Albert's journey was an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.